What's up guys and welcome back to On the Brain. If you didn't know, and well there's no way you could since I haven't talked about it before, I've been slowly working on a video where I talk about all the aspects of 9/11. Not just the day itself, but everything that led to it and the effects it has had since. Considering that people born after that date will be able to legally drink this year, they're really only able to learn about it secondhand. And the research I've done and personal experiences I've had, I've come across plenty of misconceptions that may lead them and others to think the wrong thing. So today, I wanted to debunk 5 misconceptions that I'm honestly a little tired of seeing. It's important to remember several key factors when it comes to this myth. First, where did that number even come from? On a normal day, at full capacity, the towers could hold a total of 50,000 people. However, 9/11 was obviously not a normal day. 8 years before the attacks on February 26, 1993, a car bomb was detonated in the parking garage underneath WTC-3, or the hotel. It killed 6 people and injured hundreds. At the time of 9/11, this was still rather fresh in the minds of people who worked there, and though it wasn't many, some people were hesitant to continue working at what was clearly a terrorist target. You have to keep in mind, despite there being no serious damage to the towers during the car bomb, they still needed to be evacuated and, well, by foot. The elevators were out of commission. This meant that the entirety of the 110-story towers had to be evacuated at an excruciatingly slow pace as they were actually full at the time. So again, this wasn't a huge factor, but still worth noting. Something that is way more important though, is remembering the time of the first attack. Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. Now here in America, most workdays start at 9 a.m. or about 15 minutes after the plane struck. Now, being a World Trade Center, this obviously wasn't the case for everybody, as thousands of people were already inside the building. However, the majority of offices inside the towers started their days at 9 a.m. And this meant, on top of the already reduced capacity, a significant number of people were just not inside the buildings. Now that is easily the biggest factor to remember. Now, one more thing to point out is the fact that the attack itself did happen and there were 2 buildings. Once the first plane slammed into the North Tower, people did start evacuating the South Tower, or Tower 2. And it is true that they were told to return to their desks as the danger was in the other building. But it's really important to remember that no one thought it was a terrorist attack. Well, some people did, and that's why a lot of people still left. But the reason they were told to go back is because they didn't want all the people from Tower 2 getting in the way of the operations at Tower 1. And that was it. So in reality, instead of 50,000 people in the towers, the number was actually closer to about 12 to 15,000. Had the attacks happened later in the day, say closer to 11 in the morning, both towers would have been pretty full and that number would have been way higher. But the hijackers chose the flights they did as they correctly assumed that fewer people would be on them, meaning there would be less resistance. This is a myth that 9/11 truthers started in an attempt to prove the towers fell in a controlled demolition and not because a fully loaded jetliner slammed into them at several hundred miles an hour and burned untamed for at least an hour. They claim that the towers fell at free fall speeds, they do some math, and then they show the footage for an equal amount of time that matches their math. But the reality is the towers did not fall at free fall speeds, and I don't even need to do any math to show that to you. All I need to do is show you this picture. Here's the piece of wreckage from one of the towers falling, and here's the towers still standing above that point. If the towers collapsed at free fall speeds, this would be impossible. The lowest piece of wreckage would have to be equal to the highest point of the collapsing tower, with the free falling wreckage being shown beneath the collapsing tower. That only means they did not fall at free fall speeds. And truthers and people who believe this tend to say that means the towers fell in about 8 to 10 seconds, but this just isn't true either. In fact, both collapses took much longer than that. Let's start by looking at the South Tower. Now, this is a little hard to show as there aren't many full views of the collapse. Anyone who was close enough to have a full view of the tower was either running for their lives or died. But this video has a clean view of the majority of the tower and shows aspects of the collapse most people don't even realize, including how the core of the South Tower also stood for several seconds before collapsing itself, just like we see in the North Tower later. But let's time this. If I start timing the moment that the collapse starts internally, which you can tell when it starts to cloud up in this section, and I stop it at the moment that the core collapses behind the dust, then the South Tower collapse took 30 full seconds, or 3 times as long as freefall speeds would take. If for some reason you want to not include the core collapsing, which when you're timing the full collapse of a building I don't know why you wouldn't do, it still comes out to around 20 seconds. And another way that I can show you that is in this video taken from the base of the towers. These firemen and the cameraman at their side went running for their lives as soon as the tower started collapsing, so unfortunately we can't actually see the full collapse. However, there is much better audio of the collapse in this one. It starts at this point and runs the rest of the clip. Let's watch. Now, unfortunately, the clip does end, and I can promise you I didn't edit it. I'll have the link in the description down below. But the audio of the collapse was still going for the entirety of this 20-second clip. Also, from this angle, you can further see what I was talking about earlier, where points of the wreckage are below the point of collapse. Now, for most people, they think the North Tower is a little different, but it's only because the core was notably left standing for more time than in the South Tower, and you can see it extremely clearly in this footage here. So for this tower, I'm going to split it into 2 times. I'm going to have before this part collapses, and then the full time as well. So let's watch. Now, you'll notice that footage does not actually include the start of the collapse, and yet it still was about 20 seconds total. And if you want to know how I'm tracking this, well, the first answer is 20 years of research and watching this thing over and over again, unfortunately. And the second answer is just following the top point of the collapse and watching as new debris comes out. I personally stop the count when the smoke finally reaches the bottom as it's coming from the collapse of the tower. So that's how I got 20 seconds here. But if we include the collapse of the core, it's actually another 10 to 15 seconds on top of that, meaning that the full collapse of the North Tower took about 35 to 37 seconds, depending where you want to stop counting, as it is a little hard to see when the core fully collapses behind all the dust and smoke. However, that's also kind of the point. The people who say that the towers fell at free fall speeds don't ever include the cores falling or the accurate times, and if you're going to count how long they took to collapse, then you should count how long it took for them to collapse. Because otherwise, it's like saying it took me 10 minutes to eat a full pizza, but only counting half the slices. The reality is, the collapses were not at free fall speeds. This is a really interesting one, as for some reason it's thought that no plane wreckage was found. Not just at the World Trade Center, but anywhere. And this tends to be perpetuated by conspiracy theorists who say that there were no planes, or that the Pentagon was hit by a missile, or some even claim that Flight 93 just never existed. But in reality, parts from all 4 planes were recovered. Starting with Flight 93, as it was the easiest to recover parts from, 95% of the plane was found, and alongside that, they found plenty of human remains. And by the way, this is like a subpart to this myth, because Flight 93 wasn't the only plane they found human remains from. At the Pentagon, they were able to identify the remains of 184 people, including the 5 hijackers. And if they were found, you can think about the passengers behind them. And at the World Trade Center, in the aftermath, workers recovered and identified dozens of remains from Flight 11 victims. Some workers even found bodies strapped to airplane seats and discovered the body of a flight attendant with her hands bound. In fact, within a year, the remains of 33 passengers aboard Flight 11 were found, and alongside them were pieces of the plane itself, including this one. And in the footage of 175, you can see its engine shooting through the South Tower and to the streets below. This was actually recovered, along with several other pieces, of course. And going back to the Pentagon, it's a pretty similar situation to Flight 93, where a majority of the plane was actually recovered, including some extremely identifiable parts. This myth is perpetuated almost entirely by earlier plans of 9/11 and racism. The very first plan for 9/11 was to actually use 10 planes. The attacks were to cover the entirety of the United States, starting on the East Coast and making their way west as people woke up. And the final plane wasn't even going to end in a crash, but instead with a manifesto. This plan had some serious flaws and challenges. If it were to be executed, it very likely would have failed. Training the 19 hijackers used in the real plan was already quite challenging and led to a good amount of suspicion. Adding another 30 on top of that would have been all but impossible. Now, there were several other planes that day thought to be involved, but all were cleared without further incident. Claims of Middle Eastern men refusing to leave their planes and having similar items as the hijackers in their luggage not only doesn't mean much, it's extremely racist. I mean, think about it. You're on a flight, you're in your seat, ready to go, and then they tell you, just kidding, we're not flying, you have to get off now. Not every single person is going to be happy about that, especially back in 2001, because people couldn't just pull up their smartphones and see what was happening. There are simply no substantiated claims of further attacks being planned on 9/11. It's pretty easy to see where this myth came from, as less than 2 years after the attacks, the United States invaded Iraq, as the Bush administration claimed that they had proof Saddam Hussein was holding weapons of mass destruction and were possibly in league with Al-Qaeda. Now, today, nearly 20 years after the invasion, we know that simply was never true. And we know it's not true because the Bush administration would have been the first people to say it was, and they never did. Also, because we never found any weapons of mass destruction or linked to Al-Qaeda. So why did the Bush administration tell Congress that they had proof? Well, shortly after 9/11, forces in Afghanistan found and captured the mastermind behind the attacks, Sheikh Mohammed. I'm probably saying that wrong. He was promptly taken to Guantanamo Bay, where by the way he still is today, and he was tortured. I don't care what the US wants to say about it, I don't care what terminology they want to use. He was tortured. Now, does he deserve to be in jail and face further punishment? Absolutely. He was responsible for the deaths of 3,000 innocent people. But he was still tortured. And during that torture, he was asked several times if Iraq was involved and how. He actually denied this for quite a while, but as the torture continued, he finally said that Iraq was involved. And this was the proof that they had. The US got what they wanted, and a second war was started, Bush got what he wanted, and more Americans died. Ultimately, when no connection was found, they returned to Mohammed and asked why he said Iraq was involved, and his simple answer was, "You were torturing me." But those were 5 misconceptions on, okay, but wait, what about Building 7? Because I mean, it wasn't hit by a plane. Yeah, but neither were Buildings 3, 4, 5, or 6, or the church, or the Deutsche Bank across the street, all of which were either destroyed or suffered such damages they had to be demolished. Okay, but Building 7 still collapsed, it wasn't destroyed later. Isn't that suspicious? No, it's actually not. A 110-story building came tumbling down upon it, leaving several gigantic gashes, all seen by firemen by the way, and igniting a raging fire that was left to burn uncontrolled for nearly 8 hours. Under other circumstances, the building probably would have survived, but when the rescue workers were trying to, rescue people, it really wasn't a priority. It's also important to note that the collapse of Building 7 actually started internally. Make sure you watch the full collapse of Building 7 and not just when it starts after the penthouse already collapsed. You can see it in the left here fall several seconds before the rest of the building comes down. In fact, the footage we have of Building 7 falling is really just the outer shell falling down on itself. Anyway, that was 5 plus 1 misconceptions about 9/11 that hopefully I helped clear up for at least one person. Truth be told, there is so much more about all of these topics that I could easily talk about, but I'm making this on a Tuesday evening after work. So for now, thank you for watching. That's what's been on the brain.